and welcome to the Danish Institute. My name is Lawrence Pell, I'm the director of the Institute. This evening, my main role is to introduce to you the program this evening. First of all, in a very brief format, our two speakers, our main speaker, Ikonomou, and our interventionist or discussant, Sotiris and Rizas. The format is the following. Ikonomou, who is from the University of Copenhagen, from the Saxon Institute, and also is a Henschel Fellow, has been studying the League of Nations for a long period, has published in Danish and in English, and is right now, but that is what Haakon will tell us, also be studying a Greek, or a Greek, Ottoman Greek diplomat, later a Greek diplomat, Thanassis Aghnides, but Rizas, the Carlsberg Fellow and Senior Fellow of the Danish Institute, will enlighten you more about the details of what Haakon is working on and doing in a little while. Sotiris and Rizas, we are very pleased and honored to have you here. You are the director of the Research Center for the Study of Modern Greek History. You have a very long list of publications. Rizas will be able to assist us a little bit, but the main themes are geopolitics, it's international relation, it's Greek politics, it's contemporary history, it's some very important key moments in Greek-American relations and Greek politics. So there is a wide variety of approaches to history which you have offered to us here. So once again, welcome to the Danish Institute, especially to our two speakers. And now I would like to let over the floor to Christos.
Thanks, Maurice. Thank you all for being here today. And of course, we are grateful to Ikonomou and Sotiris Rizas for accepting our invitation to discuss with us Haakon's book in the making on Thanassis Aghnides, an important but also hitherto understudied figure from the interwar period. Ikonomou is a teaching associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and a Greco-Turkish fellow with a research project, European Security in a Changing World, General Disarmament between International Organizations, States Sovereignty. Haakon has published widely on European and international organizations in the 20th century, and is currently preparing a co-edited volume on global biographies coming out with Manchester University Press, as well as a monograph entitled The International Bureaucrat in the 20th Century, a global biography of Thanassis Aghnides. He is a book review and online media editor of Diplomatica, and published by Real, and co-founder of the global biographies working. Haakon is discussing today how Aghnides work with the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish compulsory population exchange, so the coming together of his personal life, his professional ambitions, his patriotic feelings, and his international loyalties. Haakon argues that Aghnides' confluence of loyalties acted as a sort of multiplier of influence, and compares Aghnides to an alchemist, balancing and combining these elixirs of power carefully. For the cause as much as for his career. Through this prism, Haakon will show the deep and sustained intervention of the League of Nations in modernizing Greece from above. This was, Haakon argues, not only an economic, humanitarian or even political project, but an ideological one of muscular liberal internationalism. An internationalism that contained all the contradiction that Aghnides himself embodied. Sotiris Rizas is director of research at the Research Center for the Study of Modern Greek History at the Academy of Athens. Sotiris has written and co-edited numerous books and collective volumes on such a wide range of topics and themes as Greek political and diplomatic history, international relations, Greco-Turkish relations, and prosopographical studies. But Sotiris is not only a distinguished scholar, but also an acute observer of current international affairs. And as such, Sotiris has a deep understanding of the role of international organizations, their global scope, and the impact their interventions may have locally. I consider his double capacity as a key element that makes him an ideal discussant for this talk, which touches upon issues across the globe. Without further ado, Haakon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very, very glad to be here and honored to be here, in fact. And yeah, thanks Mogens, thanks Rizas, thank you Sotiris, Rizas in advance. And I should also thank Marcos, who can see this Sotiris, who's sitting in the back here because he's been very helpful with translations and getting the English Greek translations right. So thanks everyone, and thanks to Dia for organizing this. So after the Asia Minor catastrophe, my entire family fled from free Greece, like the rest of the refugees. The Greek League of Nations official Thanassis Aghnides wrote in 1928. At the time, he worked to assist the Greek government in securing international loans and restructuring their health sector to absorb the enormous influx of refugees. But what did it mean to be an international official in such a situation? This lecture will explore how Aghnides' work with the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish compulsory population exchange saw the coming together of his personal life, his professional ambitions, his patriotic feelings, his international loyalties. And as I will argue, Aghnides' confluence of these loyalties acted as a sort of multiplier of influence. Like an alchemist, he balanced and combined these elixirs of power carefully, for the cause as much as for his career. And through this prism, the lecture shows, I hope, the deep and sustained intervention of the League of Nations in modernizing, in quotes, Greece from above. This was, I argue, not only an economic, humanitarian, or even political project, but an ideological project of, as Christos mentioned, muscular liberal internationalism. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. An internationalism that contained all the contradictions that Aghnides himself embodied. I will make this argument in 5 parts. I will talk about how Aghnides entered the League of Nations and the League of Nations Secretariat, how he worked with the population exchange in the early phase. Then I will look at one part of this kind of modernization from above, economic governance. Then the second aspect of it, the sanitary reforms, and then conclude by reflecting on this concept of muscular liberal internationalism, if that's at all fruitful. But first, let me outline the career of the man that runs as a red thread throughout this lecture. Born in the town of Nigren in Cappadocia in 1889, Thanassis Aghnides got a job at the League of Nations Secretariat in 1919. After several years in the political section of the Secretariat, he became director of the challenging disarmament section in 1930. Thanassis Aghnides thus became the secretary of the infamous World Disarmament Conference, which was the direct cause for Nazi Germany's withdrawal from the League in October 1933. In 1939, he became the Undersecretary of the by then diminished World Organization. After a stint as Greek ambassador to London during the Second World War, he became chairman of the International Civil Service Advisory Board. and was one of the chief architects of the United Nations Civil Service, a model that informed several other ILOs. He was a most influential international civil servant with a career spanning 5 decades and 6 secretaries general in the League and in the United Nations. Now, the first part, entering the League Secretariat. After his family, as many more well-off Cappadocians, moved to Constantinople, Aghnides received his early education at 3 different Christian institutions in the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s and the early 1900s. The Greek Orthodox Grand Patriarchal School, the French Catholic College of St. Joseph, a school with close ties to French officialdom and the Francophone community in Constantinople, and then the American Protestant Anatolia College. Anatolia College in the town of Merziphon in the Pontic region near the Black Sea proved a particularly decisive experience for Aghnides. The school attracted students from the Armenian and the Greek Christian minorities, pursued the distinctly liberal mission of planting, quote, the seeds of a more progressive and fair civil society. With excellent grades from his early education, he then qualified to study law. And due to his language skills and the close ties between the foreign Christian schools and the diplomatic corps in Constantinople, he was drawn into the French and the British diplomatic community and started tutoring newly arrived diplomats in written and spoken Turkish and Greek. And one of his students was the young British diplomat Harold Nicholson. Like so many Ottoman Greeks, however, Thanassis left the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s, presumably in 1911. Coming from a relatively well-off and large family, he had the means and networks to facilitate a move westwards. Together with his 2 brothers, Thanassis left for Belgium before settling down in Paris. Here he retook his legal degree at the University of Paris, but was increasingly drawn to the political work of the Ottoman Greeks in Paris. During the latter half of the First World War, Thanassis Aghnides wrote several music reviews on performances of Greek music, and he used these reviews to convey an unmistakable preference for a new and enlarged Greek and a world order without Ottoman imperial tutelage. Instead, Aghnides spoke of peaceful coexistence between a brotherhood of well-defined nation-states, with Greece thoroughly anchored in a Western conception of modernity. His artistic work sparked the interest of the liberal Greek statesman Eleftheris Venizelos, the main architect of the Greek entrance in the First World War on the side of the Entente, and the near realization of the Magali idea, and he was in Paris at the time. According to Aghnides, Venizelos called him in for a meeting sometime in 1915-16 under the pretense that he wanted to discuss an article written by Aghnides entitled Greek Art Itself Again. The content of the article itself convinced Venizelos that Aghnides was of the right ideological persuasion, and Venizelos, in typical fashion, recruited the young Cappadocian to his personal diplomatic network. Aghnides obliged and was stationed to London as Director of Communications for the Greek Embassy during the last year of the First World War. In particular, he reported on British and American views on Greece's territorial claims after the potential Allied victory. Aghnides thus played a part in Venizelos' plans to win Allied support for a greater Greece. Among other things, Aghnides wrote regularly for the periodical La Méditerranée Orientale, published by a group of Ottoman Greeks based in Paris and London. Here Aghnides started to use terms such as national self-determination, civilizational rights, and minority protection. He drew on and reviewed new scientific works on ethnicity, geography, and the nation-state, and formulated his analysis in an explicitly Wilsonian language, placing Greece in a new international order of peaceful, liberal nations. By the end of the First World War, Aghnides had left the Foreign Service and returned to Paris and was looking for new work. And here he met the by then well-established diplomat, his old Turkish student, Harold Nicholson, who worked for the British delegation at the Paris Peace Conference and had recently been recruited to the Secretariat of the League of Nations by Eric Drummond himself. Nicholson wrote to Drummond to recommend the young Greek for a post in the League Secretariat. And given that Aghnides' candidacy also had the support of Venizelos and Greek Foreign Minister Nikolaos Politis, the Secretary General happily obliged. Aghnides started out in the minorities section of the League Secretariat, overseeing the minorities treaties signed by the new or re-established Central, Eastern and Southeastern European states, securing a certain religious, educational and linguistic rights to national minorities. He was the only Greek in the section, otherwise dominated by Scandinavians, but had, apart from his legal and diplomatic background, very specific linguistic and religious competencies that made him a useful broker of what was often difficult negotiations and considerations. He was then brought into the political section in 1922, tasked with monitoring national and ethnic disputes in the Balkans and Asia Minor, starting with the Greco-Bulgarian population exchange. Still, in this situation, he was very unsettled. He was on a short-term contract, no citizenship, no formal affiliation with the Greek MFA, and alone in the League Secretariat in having local expertise on a range of crucial issues. Now, the League would be involved in the forced population exchange between Greece and Turkey in many ways. For one, it appointed the neutral members of the mixed commission overseeing the population exchange. Additionally, the minority section monitored, negotiated and collected information on the many instances of violence, discrimination and pressures against the minorities that were excluded from the exchange. Moreover, the League Secretariat became a nodal point for the governments, relief organizations, international commissions, banks and financial bodies that managed the fallout and the aftermath of the population exchange. With the Secretariat gaining this new role, Aghnides first became one of its intermediaries, connecting the mixed commission overseeing the exchange, various refugee and humanitarian organizations, the League Secretariat and Council, and the Greco-Turkish governments. Towards the latter part of the 1920s, he became increasingly important in facilitating the economic and sanitary reconstruction of Greece. Aghnides was drawn into the politics of the population exchange through his connections with Venizelos, who returned to Greek politics as the chief negotiator of the Lausanne Conference. His job, it seems, was to keep the dialogue between the Greek statesman, the director of the political section, Paul-Joseph Mantoux, and the Secretary General of the League, Sir Eric Drummond. He helped to interpret Greek demands, concerns, and politics within the League context, and instructed the Greek government on how to best get their points across. As a report on his efforts stated, not a day went by without Aghnides being pulled into a council meeting, diplomatic consultations, or some other secretariat meeting to clarify one question or the other. He was also decisive in keeping in an informal back channel between Fridtjof Nansen and Venizelos. Before and during the Lausanne negotiations, Aghnides had been prompted by the High Commission of Refugees to tell Venizelos that he could, quote, achieve a lot through direct correspondence with Nansen, as long as this is kept secret. But his involvement was also deeply personal. Among other efforts, he helped to move his old alma mater, Anatolia College, from Mexico to Thessaloniki. again with the help of Venetians. The personal aspect is even more evident in Aghnides' 1924 trip to Greece to report to the Secretary General Drummond on the progress and problems of the population exchange. Here, Aghnides visited, among several places, the refugee camps in the outskirts of Athens, together with Nicholas Politis and several others, local politicians. This reconnected him with a world he had left behind some 12 years ago. His empathy was clearly directed towards those that had a similar social background as himself. He was, for instance, particularly struck by those who had lived affluent lives in the Ottoman Empire and now had to, quote, resign themselves to live for people in a room and work to earn their daily bread. The Greek Orthodox upper middle class, which he belonged to himself, uprooted in brutal fashion, had lost their former purpose and dignity. And he writes in this report back to the League, "I've been visited by a large number of industrialists, traders and professionals from Asia Minor who are currently refugees in Greece. The fate of these people, especially those who belong to the liberal professions, is really sad. Their capacities remain unused, and as most of these refugees left their fortune in Asia Minor, they lead and will lead a hard life in Greece. I spoke with doctors, lawyers of undeniable ability, who complained to me of the situation created for their class of refugees because, they said, they do not even have enough money to open a consulting office or an attorney's office, which would have, in a way, resettled them in their new life the war gave them." Aghnides thought them to have, quote, a lot of strength to show so much courage. His otherwise relatively sober report turned emotional. Mr. Politis was full of admiration, Aghnides brought back to Geneva, and had whispered to him the following words: "It looks like these people are of a superior race." Though his report to the League, for obvious reasons, bore no trace of it, Aghnides' mother had in fact been one of the refugees that fled the emergent Turkish Republic and lived out the rest of her life in Piraeus, according to Aghnides, without ever learning proper Greek. His father, despite his later proclamations that the entire family fled for Greece, seemingly stayed back the few years he lived on in Constantinople as part of the Orthodox Greek community allowed to remain there according to the special provisions of the Convention of the Greco-Turkish Population Exchange. Neither did the report mention that Aghnides' field trip was in fact his first ever visit to Greece. In some ways, this was his first encounter with the realities of his convictions, and understandably, a moment of cognitive dissonance. It was in this context that Aghnides wrote to Greek authorities describing himself as an amphibious employee, working hard to align his internationalism, his patriotic loyalties, and his personal ambitions. In fact, he was at the same time working to be naturalized as a Greek citizen and gain recognition and rank within the Greek MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For Aghnides, this was a stressful and even agonizing situation. As he wrote, "What I really want is security." But his influence and impact as an international official lay precisely in his efforts to serve his government in line with the internationalist agenda of the League. As we shall see, his multiple loyalties and circles of influence were also a kind of a multiplier of influence. Now, to the first modernization from abroad. The unprecedented influx of refugees from the former Ottoman Empire, combined with the efforts of integrating new territories gained in the north, meant that Greece faced a particularly harsh reconstruction era. Having exhausted its domestic financial tools and seeing prices rising fivefold, while the drachma lost over 90% of its pre-war value between 1920 and 1927, Greek authorities were forced to search for foreign capital. The League and the Bank of England assisted Greece in securing a first £10 million loan in New York and London. The Refugee Law of 1924 was managed by the Independent and Internationally Compulsory Refugee Settlements Commission. This commission had to report to the League Council quarterly and publish an annual statement of accounts. Meanwhile, the Greek government handed over 500,000 hectares of land to the commission for the purposes of resettling refugees. The loan was given on strict terms and would eventually also prove not enough to settle 1.3 million refugees and rebuild an economy in tatters. However, the prospect of future loans was frustrated by the military coup in 1925, and under Pangalos' reign, political instability and detrimental policy choices led the Bank of England, and thus the League of Nations, to impose an effective loan embargo on the country. The page turned with the restoration of democracy, first under Prime Minister Thanassis Aghnides and his ecumenical government in December 1926, and then with the return of elixirs to domestic politics and premiership in July 1928. With this, talks of the second supplementary refugee loan were reopened. A long process ensued, swearing off the policies of the dictatorial Pangalos era, particularly its military spending, recommitting to the political and economic gospel of the Bank of London and the League of Nations, and paying off outstanding war debts to Britain, the US, and France. Indeed, the Bank and the League Financial Committee used the prospect of the loan as a carrot and a stick, eventually pushing for the establishment of an independent central bank, stabilization of the drachma, and deep reforms of the accounting procedures of the state. The new Geneva Protocol, which came after yet another thorough investigation by a League-led financial commission sent to Greece, included the statutes of the new Bank of Greece, drafted jointly by League officials and Greek officials in London, and the stipulation of a League-backed tripartite loan. 1/3 went to the completion of the refugee settlement, 1/3 to sanitizing the budget deficits, and 1/3 went to monetary stabilization. The loan was floated primarily in London and New York in the spring of 1928, marking, it seemed for a moment, Greece's financial rehabilitation. And throughout this process, lasting over 5 years, Aghnides was an important contact point between, particularly, Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Greece and later the Bank of Greece, Sotiris, Head of the Economic Financial Section of the League, Arthur Salter, and Secretary General Eric Drummer. And once removed, also, Governor of the Bank of London, Montague Norman. His main task was to convince, on the one hand, Salter, and through him the Financial Committee of the League, that Greek authorities, following Pangalos, were devoted to deep social and economic reforms, maintaining peace and stability, and aligning with the League's wider political goals. Unique to Aghnides' approach in these conversations, which lasted for a very long time, was his realization that the uncompromising attitude of the Bank of London and the League both was related to Greek militarism, antagonism towards League supervision, and the ad hoc fiscal and financial policy of the dictator. As the economic historian Yana Aghnides writes, as Salter noted, the League's financial committee wanted evidence that Greece was firmly determined to sincerely devote itself in the task of maintaining the status quo, also bigger political role here. Aghnides carried this message forward to Sotiris multiple times. He writes in 1926, "My friend, you cannot imagine how important this straightforward idea is. Let us bear in mind that people are utterly exhausted from the consecutive wars to such an extent that any politician which makes the slightest insinuation of possible hostilities are considered enemies of social civility and face the contempt of international public opinion." This is a league lingo, one could say. "They want to forcefully discipline us and put some sense in our heads," Aghnides remarked in another letter. To his mind, there was no doubt that with a consistent display of good faith and more common sense than in recent past, as he wrote, Greece would secure a new loan with reasonable conditions. That was his hope. To Aghnides, this entailed showing tangible results of financial reform, to settle all outstanding conflicts and debts amicably within the League of Nations, and to accept the financial scrutiny and oversight of League officials and bankers before the loan was secured. Thus, while clearly motivated by the plight of the unfortunate Greek people, as he wrote, he was also the communicative end-piece of the League's technocratic stick. So when in the summer of 1928 Venizelos used the unpopular banking reform to throw the Zionist government and position himself for an electoral comeback, yet another chapter of the Genevan intervention in Greece ensued. Now, the financial reform paved the way for the League's wholesale restructuring of the Greek public health sector. After winding down its initial combating of epidemics in Greece, the League would increase its sanitary presence later in the decade, this time on the invitation of the Greek statesman Eleftherios Venizelos during his last stint as premier. Venizelos was pushing major reforms, public reforms, with the help of foreign loans and interventions from the League and other international agencies. The immediate occasion was the outbreak of an epidemic of dengue fever affecting 1.3 million people between late 1927 and the summer of 1928, and seriously straining the country's economy, though reforms had been long overdue in any case, as previous attempts of deeper restructuring of the sector had been halted by the refugee influx of 1922-23. So this was the beginning of a complete sanitary reorganization of Greece. Following a comprehensive study, a League Commission proposed a very detailed scheme, including a brand new administrative center, new technical services, a new school of hygiene called the Athens Center, health services in prefectures handpicked by the League of Nations Health Organization, and health services for the metropolitan areas of Athens, Piraeus, and the city of Saloniki. The Commission made additional detailed recommendations for the running of hospitals, private and public, the fight against malaria and tuberculosis, labor conditions, and social insurance and quarantine services. For the full execution of the plan, the Greek government decided to entrust the technical control to 3 foreign experts. And while the League invited the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Division to provide partial funding for several of the proposed projects and set up a fellowship program which would train a new elite of Greek medical personnel. The idea was that the state health services built up and gradually expanding to cover half of the total number of prefectures would transition into a permanent public health service in Greece around 1933. Though the reforms in the end were stunted by administrative resistance, the political struggles of Venizelos himself, and first and foremost by the onset of the Great Depression, they are a striking example of the deep penetration of the League's technocratic governance and its network-like institutional reach. Its ethos was that of public health science, undergirded by American methods of organization and philanthropic designs, and also imperial tropes of modernization and betterment. Neither Venizelos' invitation to the League's ability to visit and investigate the facts on the ground, the Greek administration's initial acceptance of internationalized interventionism, nor League Health Director Ludwig Reichmann's success in bringing the Rockefeller Foundation on board would have taken place as it did without Aghnides' continuous communication and footwork between the League of Nations and the Greek government. This is the League Health section, and on the right here you see Ludwig Reichmann, who was its director all the way until the Second World War. Aghnides' most important role as member of the political section, but seconded to this case, was once again to communicate and translate between the Greek government and the League. Particularly at two junctures, this proved vital. Firstly, when he helped pave the way for the Greek government and the Undersecretary of Health, Apostolos Sotiris, to formally invite the League to intervene. This was very important for the swift response of the League, and was partially the result of a constant barrage of letters from Aghnides to the Greek government on the procedures of the League, and how to kind of plant the invitation correctly to get the intervention from the League. Secondly, in order to create the right circumstances for Reichmann to use his influence to get the Rockefeller Foundation on board, and thus secure the necessary financial power and technical expertise to see the reforms through. Aghnides ceaselessly impressed upon the Greek government the importance of showing devotion and readiness to engage in deep reform, respond quickly and officially to all correspondence, facilitate the visit of the League Committee in every possible way, which he also helped plan, and send their most able technical experts to Geneva whenever called upon. Aghnides, in this context, acted as a kind of a self-effacing medium to create understanding between two parties. Paraphrasing here Kostas Konstantinos' understanding of diplomacy. Again, Aghnides' multiple loyalties are indispensable for understanding of his agency. It was the amalgam of his emotional investment, patriotism, religious internationalism, and bureaucratic loyalty that made him so tirelessly devoted to this specific case. It was his linguistic, cultural, and personal affinity with Greece that made him such a skilled communicator between the two polities. Now, our understanding of the League of Nations has changed quite drastically over the last few decades. From being portrayed as a failure, it has been reinterpreted as a laboratory of global governance in a multitude of fields that had a real impact on the interwar period, and which has shaped our attempts at ordering the world for the rest of the 20th and now 21st century, for better or worse. This has led to a reinterpretation of the League as a more forceful actor, particularly in the political, legal, and economic restructuring of post-imperial Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkans and Asia Minor, which has been labelled a ground zero of international world-making in the words of Natasha Wheatley, perhaps taking it a bit too far. One of the League's most crucial tasks became to reshape the areas covered by the disintegrating Ottoman, Habsburg, German, and Russian empires, and those regions immediately impacted by this in the image of Wilsonian sovereignty. The old imperial lands, and perhaps particularly the shatter zones of the Ottoman Empire, became a vast and immediate testing ground for these Wilsonian principles, as they clashed with the schemes of the great powers and the competing irredentist and ethno-nationalist ambitions of nations and peoples of the region. Well tried, but also new modalities of imperial and liberal governance were ushered in. The unmixing of people, the rebordering of lands, and the economic and political reconstruction of territories in various states of destitute and ordered along the civilizational metrics of the victorious powers. This was the core of a more muscular internationalism which fused technocratic, imperial, and liberal strands. Now, Aghnides was a man conscious of his past, carefully committed to this complex and variegated internationalism, and a Greek patriot, like they only could be made outside the borders of the state. Equally trying to discipline Greece into some liberal Wilsonian modernity, with financial tools, with technocratic health governance, with self-effacing diplomacy in the name of the League. Equally trying to distance himself from the infights and uncertainties of domestic politics, while retaining strong ties with the elites he perceived as trustworthy, or at least sustainable, Venizelos and Sotiris in particular. Trying to be of service while servicing his career and professional security. And equally, trying to create a language of Greek patriotism which combined his specific brand of religious internationalism, the connection between Greek antiquity and the contemporary fight for democratic liberalism, and a fleeting sense of civilizational destiny, expressed through his many musical analogies that would permeate his entire international career. As the perennial medium between Greece and the League, through the vortex of the Greek-Turkish population exchange, he would embody the amalgamated contradictions of both. Thank you.
Sotiris for the invitation to attend and offer a commentary on impressive lecture of Dr. Haakon. I try to focus on three things that mainly are related to the background of Dr. Haakon Ikonomou's lecture. Related mainly to Greece's monetary stabilization in 1927. Firstly, the League is an international organization. It is a forum of sovereign nation-states. It promotes, though, an extended agenda of multilateral cooperation. It is not only the allegiance owed by the staff exclusively to the League. It's the areas of competence, of League's competence, finance, economic policy, which constitute undoubtedly an agenda that is quite extensive. It is developed next to traditional notions of international politics, focused mainly on security. The agenda and the policy requirements are mainly influenced by the British, who sought to restore the pre-war international system in a substantially different context, though. The process, nonetheless, is a complicated interaction between national governments and the League staff. Aghnides is at the center of this complicated process as a League's functionary. The second thing relates directly to Greece's monetary stabilization, the necessity of a new loan in order to complete the rehabilitation of refugees who fled Turkey in 1922 as a result of the defeat of the Greek army Minor, is the catalyst. The immediate needs are undeniable. Greece's fiscal position is dire, but other issues are involved as well. Greece's fiscal imbalances were partly the consequence of the armaments program undertaken by Pangalus, who aspired to the recapture of Eastern Thrace. That amounted to the revival of the Eastern question that had been settled with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Monetary stabilization related, though, to modernization process that was to be imposed on the small states that emerged from the breakup of the multi-ethnic empires. That's the case of Austria, Hungary, with the end of World War I, or states that preceded the Great War but reached the boundaries of their territorial claims. That is the case of Greece and Bulgaria. This process of modernization entailed a monetary dimension. The state had to guarantee monetary stability that would allow participation in the gold exchange standard restored in 1925. As parities were fixed, the external stability of the currency was the key requirement. However, financial institutions in Greece, seen from the leagues, the cities and the Bank of England's vantage point, were somewhat archaic, as the most important financial institution of the country was the National Bank of Greece. Its share of savings was unparalleled, but it was odd at the time that the National Bank had the right to issue currency, being simultaneously the most preeminent commercial bank in the country. Overall, the League's role would be instrumental at the intersection of national integration, fiscal, financial, political, and strategic domains. It was in this context that Sir Sotiris, the head of the Financial Committee of the League, pointed out in February 1926, well before the downfall of General Pangalos, that Greece had to confirm its commitment to the territorial status quo. Furthermore, Greece had to accept a considerable degree of control of its economic policy and to undertake significant institutional engineering under the auspices of the League of Nations. As Senator Mayor, who worked for the British Treasury and afterwards for the Bank of England, would state to an official of the Foreign Office, Sir Robert Sargent, who remained cautious towards the execution of Bank of England's policy on Greece's financial and monetary stabilization, there are things the small states can do or cannot do successfully. Or as Sir Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, argued, aspects of economic policy had to be depoliticized so that the integrity of the international economic order was preserved. Guarding monetary stability, an issue that affected the stability of the international financial order, was an issue that could be trusted solely or mainly to the capacity of the, could not be trusted solely or mainly to the capacity of a small state like Greece, that was marked by instability and disruption. It is in this complex situation that Aghnides operated very often as a go-between, mainly transmitting the policy of the League to the Greek political and banking elites, than vice versa. Greece's political setup was almost, as always, complicated. The elections of November 1926, the first fairly conducted and with the universal participation of the political blocs after the Asia Minor debacle, showcased the persistence of the national schism between Venizelism and anti-Venizelism. The blocs were not cohesive, though their internal fissures were evident in the government of the Grand Coalition or the ecumenical cabinet in the Greek political jargon that emerged in the aftermath of the elections of November 1926. The results were slightly favorable to the Venizelists, who were identified with the Republic, but the monarchists remained a considerable minority and in a majority in Old Greece, that is the territory that constituted the Kingdom of Greece before the territorial expansion of 1912-1913. The realization that refugee settlement would not be completed unless a new law would come was a factor, along with the need to promulgate a new constitution and provide for the rehabilitation of royalist officers to the armed forces, that pushed the parties to the formation of this cabinet, which was chaired by a colorless figure, Alexandros. It was evident at the outset that the monetary reform was almost welcomed by Venizelism and the finance minister, Georgios Kafandouris. Aghnides was influential with Venizelists and particularly Emmanuel Tsuderos, deputy governor of the National Bank. It was the reaffirmation of the basic distinction between the two blocks of the national schism. It was not a class cleavage or a political doctrine that separated the two blocks, but mainly the difference of mentality between an outward-looking reformist political tradition that crystallized under the Rizas and the old political class, conservative in outlook and tied with the old Greece that was skeptical toward the reform, that implied international commitments and policy undertakings that pinned down the government's ability to reproduce its political base. The Conservative People's Party was opposed to the establishment of the central bank that would be exclusively competent on issuing money. The appearance of the Swedish group that promised to extend the loan to the Greek government was a proof to them that the Greek government would be able to refinance its debt and raise capital necessary for rehabilitation of refugees. It was obvious, though, that the key issue was Greece's reintegration into the international financial system. After the Asia Minor debacle, the Greek drachma had been depreciated considerably, the state accumulated debt and used extensively treasury bills in order to fulfill its short-term obligations. Inflation undermined the living standards of the mass of the population and was a risk for political stability, but allowed governments temporarily an easy way out from the need to stabilize the currency and balance the budget, and business to escape the burdens of an anti-inflationary policy. In essence, it was a lack of a will to implement the reforms necessary for monetary stabilization and thus to fulfill the requirements to enter the gold exchange standard, along with the interests of a part of shareholders of the National Bank that informed the policy of the People's Party. The party withdrew from the coalition government in August 1927. The Venizelists and the junior anti-Venizalist party of Ikonomou, the future dictator, paid the price of stabilization, though not Venizelos himself, who was not a participant at the time in Greek politics and thus kept his political fortune intact. Still, the reservations projected by the conservatives did not prevent stabilization and the formulation of economic policy according to its requirements. Greece abrogated its obligation only after the coming of the Press in Britain and continental Europe in 1931, following the new pattern of national economy that marked the post-crisis economic policy making in America and Europe. Thank you.
I can only thank you and hope also that you will share your notes with me, because I think what you highlight also, because I shared with you this 40-page draft chapter for you to read. 44, sorry. I'm sorry. I think is that some of the, let's say, shortcuts that you make in a talk like this are dangerous in a way. They're dangerous because there is this kind of interplay between the national and the international level, where I myself sometimes are quite puzzled by Aghnides' motivation, let's say, and my sense is that he's very much, let's say, he's an international official throughout, but he's very much activated as a go-between when Venizelos himself or the Venizelos are active. This is where he does the most of his work. And otherwise, he's trying to mediate, like for example, under Bangladesh, he's trying to mediate the damage done in the league by communicating quite closely with the ground. But this kind of interplay where he has direct effect, let's say, on policy, if not policy choices, then at least how policy is communicated with to the league, happens particularly when he has the air of Venizelos or the air of Sotiris directly. Yeah, I thank you very much for giving the context, which is also in the chapter, and I hope I got right, because I think that's extremely important. So.
I think the key point of this is the interaction between a small state and a regulated international system. Whereas you have an unregulated international system, there is a margin of independent or autonomous policy for a small state. This margin is almost non-existent when the system is regulated. And I think the point of Sir Montague Norman, who is the architect, in fact the intellectual architect, the mastermind of this restoration of the world exchange standard, is to incorporate, to integrate small states in this system as a prerequisite of stability. I must say that I don't see why this was the primary consideration. As we know, this system collapsed after the crash in America, which was the biggest economy in the world. It was not a reckless policy for small states that led to this colossal disaster, this colossal failure. On the other hand, it's understandable that small states that they feel that capital can be invested, that political disruption can emerge, which can have dire consequences for the entire system. It was only natural for Aghnides, I think, in this context to be compatible with the Venezuelans who had a better understanding of the workings of the international system, in contrast to anti-Venezuelism, who I think would thrive probably in a system that will be determined by independent nation states.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, also, but I think what is added to, let's say, Montague Norman's vision of fiscal monetary stability and a gold exchange standard where the small states are part. This is an economic vision which is equally supplemented by a political vision of status quo, of stable borders, of expenditure not being spent on rearmament, for example. And I think what happens with Bangalos and what happens until the re-establishment of democratic procedures is a genuine fear that this might be the one of those in the system links that might create a collapse and a renegotiation and an opening up of a very complex set of negotiations that have just been settled, and that this was a sort of postponement, a parenthesis, if you will, that was exceedingly dangerous, and which, from the League perspective, they feared not only, let's say, the Bank of England's monetary system, but they feared for the political equilibrium that had been established. I think this connection is one of the things that Aghnides is quite forceful in communicating throughout this period, to try to discipline them, to reconnect with this. Montague Norman actually makes a very clear list of demands. He makes it several times. It's just a bullet point list of things that needs to be done before loans can be secured again. And part of that is a very important political aspect, I would say.
Probably discipline is the key in the understanding of Norman's victim. maybe it's a doctrinal attachment to a liberal economic order that collapsed with the coming of the Great War. Probably it's something more profound, because when Britain after the war, of course, was still a great power, was still an empire. Nonetheless, it was evident that Britain was in decline, and probably empires in decline needed very disciplined international systems, rules that would not be done easily by every factor who has an interest in a more independent and more autonomous kind of economic policy. It can be further explained by the fact that America, who is the stronger economy in the world, withdrew literally from the international system, and Britain is left alone to offer guidance and preserve fundamental interests. In this sense, you understand why this system was so rigid and probably so doctrinal in its conception of monetary stability and the need to preserve fixed parities.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think also it's shown with the, you mentioned the Swedish group and other instances where Greece actually can secure loans in different outside the league structure. Maybe not the same kind of loan, but they can work without this kind of link between the Bank of England and the financial community, which is so important. Then they are actually told very clearly that this would be a detrimental choice, and I think that has to do with this kind of doctrinarian.
It is interesting. It reminds me of the Russian loan or the Chinese loan of 2010. Anyway, probably it was a real loan on offer. This of the Swedish group, and it's interesting not only that the People's Party recommended the acceptance of this offer. It is interesting that the British, on the other hand, described this offer as an indication of the irresponsible behavior of this Swedish group, which allegedly was backed by American financial interests, and those interests portrayed as trying to spread all over Europe cheap capital, which amounted to an irresponsible financial behavior.
Yes, so yeah, I think that drives home the point that
it was something beyond the boundaries of the established.
And that's where you really realize that, let's say, the Bank of England and the League of Nations, that the economic and the political, let's say, disciplinary efforts go very much hand in hand, right? So when it then comes on the outside.
Of course, by coincidence, the loan to be raised by Greece would be raised in the city of London or in the New York market, but by groups closely affiliated with British financial groups who were in the Greek financial situation.
Well,
sure. Lina, any other questions? Lina, Ekti, Dimitris, Bartos? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for the speech and the discussion. I have not understood very well if Aghnides played a role in the first refugee loan and in the establishment of the Refugee Settlement Committee. I would like you to please clarify that.
Yeah.
In my view, the League intervenes in Greece much earlier than after Pangalos. I think it is with the Refugee Settlement Committee, with the refugee loan, and I think its role in northern Greece is very, very in the line that you described of modernization and changing the way the state regulates things in northern Greece. So I would put the intervention of the League much earlier, not much earlier, but a few years earlier.
Yeah.
And apart from that, I would like to ask you what were the relations of Aghnides, the relationship with Aghnides with Pallis, Politis and Nansen, if you can say a few things about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. You're completely right, of course, that the interventions are much earlier than after Pangalos, and the first refugee loan is also something that starts to be negotiated earlier than that, and is settled before that. I follow, of course, Aghnides, so his role in these early parts are less evident for me. I mean, I haven't found that much in terms of the loans where he's involved in that, because in the early phase he's kind of outside the topic, but he's working on the Polish-Lithuanian issue at his, like in his early days in the League, and then he's actually made the interim director of the disarmament section for half a year, because nobody is coming. Nobody has taken the lead on that, and then he comes to the political section, working with Bulgaria and the Greco-Bulgarian population exchange. But then he comes to this. So I think that's why he joins that story a bit later, and I cannot claim or have not found evidence either that he's very involved before this. So in the chapter, let's say, on this, I emphasized also these early interventions of the League to bring the context right, and also the intervention of the health section, or the precursor to the health section of the League, who was also very much involved in an early phase, but then also withdrew for a while before it was came back in 1927-28. So yes, I agree with that. Aghnides, what was Aghnides, Pallis, Politis, you said, or?
And Nansen.
Nansen, yeah. I have only very few. I mean, I have letters between Aghnides and Pallis where he describes a trip. He comments on a book by Pallis where he describes that he was sent by Drummond very early to talk to Aghnides, but it's a handwritten letter, with 2 pages missing. But they seem to be quite close without me actually, quite informal in their communication. But I haven't found a lot of evidence, let's say, in his private archives that they had a very kind of continuous correspondence. So I don't know if you have input on that front. I'd be happy to hear. But with Politis, he seems to have a very strained relationship. He dislikes him, and he slanders him also during the Second World War. For, I think he sets out, he talks to the last Secretary General of the League, Sean Lester, an Irishman, tells him that Politis has given his house to the Vichy regime, and I haven't been able to confirm whether this is a rumor or true, but he also has an oral. Aghnides also has an oral testimony where he talks he's not very. He's not on good terms with Politis, and I think it has to do with, it can be policy things, but I think it actually has more to do with personalities and the fact that the great personality of the League from Greece was Politis, and Aghnides was in most respects kind of a mid-range, second-rate official, and this is also why I like him to write about him, because he's kind of an unlikely figure to run through this whole history. But the time he rises to the top, let's say, as director of the disarmament section, is also the time of the absolute collapse of the League of Nations. So he's almost like an anti-hero, or at least some sort of he considers himself a little bit also as a failure, which haunts him for the rest of his career. And when he gives his last speech to the United Nations in the Assembly after 5 decades of the career, he says, I hope, I have never lived up to my potential. That's kind of his last words. So this gives us a sense, and now I'm more talking about the biography of the person, but it gives us a sense of what kind of person he was. Very ambitious, but maybe, luck or skills or whatever never brought him all the way to the top, and I think he imagined himself to be there, and Politis was, an image of perhaps something that he could have been. I think, from what I've read from Aghnides on Politis.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. Actually, he is a fascinating figure himself, Aghnides. My feeling is that there might be, let me rephrase it. In your talk, you focused on Greek politics and the ways he became engaged to Greek politics. But in terms of his biography, I have a feeling that there must be an Aghnides outside Greece. And by having said that, I do not mean that he's peripheral or an outsider in Greek politics. As far as I understand it, he was very critical. But now you have someone who's an Ottoman Greek, and who's been traveling and who's been educated in different places, and also he's based in different countries. And I wonder if you can have a biography of this person outside or in parallel to Greek politics, but based or focusing on the politics of the League of Nations, because it seems to me that he is someone perhaps who might have an interesting biography, and in a group of an international personnel. And these people are mediators, they are translators of Western modernization and different languages and practices, and they think through this internationalism in the beginning of the 20th century. So would you like to comment on this a little bit, perhaps? Is there an Aghnides outside Greek domestic politics, and who is he?
Yes. Thank you for the question and for your remarks. My book, so this is basically, what I'm talking about here is one chapter in the book. But just to say that this is the one where I really try to bring the Greek politics in, which is also why it's so fantastic to be here and get these kinds of thorough comments and really engage, because it's not where I come from. I can say I wrote my PhD Norwegian European integration policy, and then I went to the League of Nations, and then I found these fantastic archives of Aghnides, and I thought this is too good to not write about. And most of his story is outside of Greek politics, I would say. So what comes after this is his part as a director of the disarmament section, and which is a huge part of the League of Nations history, but also a huge part of the history of why, of how the role of the international official erodes the trust in the international official, and the idea of the international official being international is actually attacked in that very moment by the Italians and by the Germans in particular, because they at that point, basically, there's a long story short, there is both the World Disarmament Conference, but there's also a big reform going on in the League, where they want to rephrase and restructure the administration in light of Germany's membership in the League in 26. And the Germans and the Italians say this idea of an international staff is false. We are only representatives of our nations, and all officials working in the League Secretariat are only representatives from Italy, from Germany, from Greece, etc. And they undermine, let's say, this kind of core principle of the staff, which is the beginning of the end of a common understanding of what an international civil service is supposed to do. Now, Aghnides, being an Ottoman Greek, belatedly Greek citizen, but always a little bit on the outside of Greek politics, is very invested in this kind of internationalism and the idea of international loyalty. And he takes on this. I think there is a kind of I'm trying to write in a chapter before this here about how there is a kind of a transition or a link between his religious ecumenical thinking and this kind of internationalism. And that this is actually a very interesting and, let's say, underappreciated way of understanding early 20th century internationalism and how it's constituted also within the League of Nations.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And this I explore and try to write out in this chapter, which is about, let's say, his worldview. So in this chapter I try to play around with what that loyalty does when he then has to work with Greece and how that kind of blends with his past, his relatively newfound patriotism, and they are both in tension but potentially also very potent when they interlink in the right way. Then with the disarmament conference, it's quite clear I try to show the limits of the agency of international civil servants and how the whole idea of international loyalty erodes in those years. But when he comes to the United Nations, he writes with very religious language about the core principle of international loyalty having to be at the heart of the United Nations. And he writes he's part of this commission that writes the standards of conduct for the United Nations official, where international loyalty is the centerpiece of that. So there is a direct, if you will, through Aghnides, direct line between this kind of ecumenical religious internationalism and the United Nations standards of conduct, which is the blueprint for all international organizations today in terms of this kind of allegiance to the organization rather than where you're coming from. And he says, also just to finish that point, he says that he's also the one that suggests that every United Nations official should get a little booklet with the codex of the international official that they get when they're hired, that they can wear in their pocket to remind themselves of these higher ideals of the United Nations. And he describes this in a letter, you know, as this is where you get this kind of you remind yourselves of the higher purpose of what you're serving here. So yeah, I think there's a very important link there, which I hope to be able to kind of show in a book length manuscript, because I think it's a very important untold story about internationalism, which is often categorized liberal, Western, whatever, but there's a long streak of another slightly hidden influence there, which is shown through the person of Aghnides.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so my question is rather provocative, I would say. It's a twofold question. But as a friend, I think I have the easiest to ask it. Basically, it links with the principle of discipline brought into conversation by Dr. Rizas that you discussed. And I have an issue or question with the term muscular internationalism. I think that if we describe what the League of Nations was trying to do with regard to the Greek case as muscular internationalism, then we give it a kind of a negative connotation. It's critical in a sense. And my question in real practical terms is, what's the other way? I mean, we have a country that was unable to deal with the situation, and we have an international organization that is called to implement a massive program of rehabilitation and settlement for the refugees. And also I think that, and it's something we have discussed also with David Rodnogra's book, that he's also very critical about the non-governmental Western humanitarian organizations. Yes, the criteria could be whatever that might be, a kind of upper look downwards from the West and so on, but still, in actual terms, they managed to provide critical assistance earlier to the refugees, and then what the Refugee Settlement Commission did was the magnitude of that work could not be doubted. Therefore, I think that once we go to the process of actually criticizing it as muscular internationalism, it shows that there is a kind of, you do it that way, or there isn't any other way, which I think gives it a kind of, as I said, negative, characterized in a negative manner, or extremely critical. Which brings me to the second question. If we do not accept the term muscular internationalism, then I don't see a really conflictual nature in Aghnides' policies. In that case, Aghnides is part of the League of Nations. He's someone who understands the Greek reality, or at least the reality of the Greek Orthodox population who arrived here as a foreigner to Greek. And therefore, I think he understands, as Effie said, how to be the mediator. How to translate a policy which is, yes, disciplinary in some aspects, but also he understands the lack of initiative within the Greek state, and also he understands what his co-nationals, Greek Orthodox Rome, call them Ottoman Greeks, whatever you want to call them, he understands better their mentality. So once we go out of that term, muscular internationalism, which I find very heavy, and it's restricting in a sense, it's like a Procrustean bed in my mind, then I think it's easier to understand also how Aghnides is this amphibious and really flexible figure as a mediator.
Thank you very much. Maybe we should start with the premise here. I wouldn't mind being a bit more muscular. I mean, I take that as a positive. I think this is the way I use the muscular is because I use it in relation to the historiography on the League, which I think has been very well has promoted or interpreted the League as enfeebled. So muscular contra enfeebled, I would say, is a positive. Yeah. But that's so that's how I try to structure that in a sense. But muscular also means force, and force means, you know, good or bad, means intervention, means discipline, means having the ability to make B do B when B doesn't want to do B. And so I think in that term, and I do put a question mark on it, and I'm playing around with it now, to be honest. So I really appreciate the comment. But I want to try to see if I can capture the fact that that there is a part of the league that has real power. Also, not only the nation states, but also their technocratic expertise, their ties to the Bank of England, their bureaucratic procedures of measuring, of making plans, implementing plans, following up on plans, etc. And this, I think, well, this is quite clear with Greece, and they say it themselves, the officials and the secretariat, they say this is the case. This is the where the league has had the most to do for the first 10, 15 years of its existence. So they put everything in there, and because it is, as you say, also a country in need of that assistance, they are also invited. You know, with interim periods uninvited, but invited to do so, particularly by Venezuelans. So there is actually a very strong interplay between the two levels, where Aghnides is quite important in this kind of translation work, and I fully agree with that. And the amphibious, which he describes himself as, is actually not so much it's a tension in one way, but it's a tension because it's not fully Greek. It's that part which he feels is lacking, in a sense, that he's trying to pursue, that he's trying to get at. He tries to get this kind of recognition of his status and his citizenship while doing this work. But to his mind, the international and the patriotism is compatible. But compatible along this kind of interventionist Venezuelan line, and he's clearly frustrated, I would say, when there are others in power who do not understand this. So yes, the conflict is, I think, lies, or conflict, let's say, his desires, let's say, lies there. Because I completely agree with the Rodonian point. I think it's not. I don't want to. I think it's a fantastic book, but we should be careful about this kind of a priori critical civilizational language to kind of put that upon this, exactly. And ergo, it's kind of a bad thing. So I need to nuance this, but I try to kind of balance that. My ambition is at least to balance these two, to say that these are both there, and in fact, well, civilizational notions of betterment and modernization, they have multiple effects, good and bad, and if it is indeed on invitation for a reform of a branch of government, if it hadn't been for the Great Depression, maybe just a very good idea, you know. So I fully agree, and I take your point. Yeah, thanks.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Haakon, for giving me the opportunity to assist you in the research and to, through a King's correspondence, witness both Greek history but also moments of international history before my eyes while doing the translation work. Some of the things I would like to add was that I managed to find on my phone the letter you're talking about the manual he wanted to give to the diplomats at the United Nations, and one of the points is that diplomatic intervention should be carried out without ulterior motives, because only then we will succeed to promote our national interests, and this should be written in gold in the preface of these manuals, codex, etc. And I'd also like to reinforce your point that, yes, from reading the material, I felt he was more of an outsider to the Greek political scene, to the extent that he might have lost his position as ambassador to London because he was not so close with this political culture in Greece. And I think he even visited Greece only a handful of times, officially and unofficially. And anyway, to go to my question, it's maybe a broader question, whether there were other international civil servants within the LON that had similar characteristics of this amphibious employee that you described, or do you think he was more of like an outlier or a unique actor in this sort of LON mechanism? And as a second question to this, I would like to add, to what extent do you think civil servants, international civil servants, affected the building of the United Nations? And did this internationalism, this muscular internationalism which you described, did it change after World War II, or was it only something during the League of Nations?
So, thank you very much. And big questions, I'd say, but very important questions. I see Aghnides, in terms of writing a history about the international civil service as the genealogy of the international civil service, I see him as use kind of microhistory term, an exceptional normal. So he's a person that allows a very distinct, unique in some ways, vantage point to write about the history of the international civil service. And there are certain characteristica that are, are actually unique to him in terms of his, let's say, the Ottoman Greek background, for example, is unique to him. His career trajectory is also relatively unique, although small states get a bigger part in the League of Nations in the 30s when it loses prestige and the Brits kind of withdraw and others withdraw and leave space for small states. But even then, it's the northern small states, it's Scandinavia in particular, that gain a very prominent role within the League machinery, and Aghnides is alone in being a Greek official with that kind of trajectory. But there are others that have this kind of amphibious nature to them. And in fact, I'd say it's a very, and that's why I stress this, it's a very important trait for international officials in general. He does it in a very unique way, let's say, but every international, through him you understand that every international official somehow has to be able to use their national and other loyalties in alignment with the ideals which are changing, the ideals of the international organization they're working with. And if they're able, and if they're able to do that, that's where the power lies, basically, for an international civil servant. And so the official rule is that you're supposed to be loyal to the international organization alone. And my interpretation of that is that that is a rule that is not meant to be taken literally. It is a rule that is meant to discipline international officials for them to always strive to align their other loyalties with the international organization. In fact, the Secretary General, the first Secretary General of the League, Sir Eric Drummond, very much emphasized this, that you didn't want to hire someone that didn't have connections, loyalties, and networks in their home government or home country, they needed to have that. But they couldn't say explicitly that they only served them or served them first or these kind of things. And this is what the Italians, for example, started to do already in the early 1920s. They said, I'm leaking all the information in secret meetings. I give them straight to the Italian government, and I only represent their interests. And when an Italian is removed from the secretariat, he should or she should immediately or naturally and logically be replaced by another Italian because that post is Italian. And that's that created a problem of the formal rule of loyalty. But if they had kept it to themselves and managed to align these two, which I think would have been difficult, but let's say if they could have, then it's not a problem. So there's a kind of illusion in that formal loyalty there. So that was the one question. And I think you will find many of these. The second question, very briefly, and we can perhaps discuss this more later because I think it's very important. The league officials, 200 league officials, more or less, transferred into the United Nations system after the Second World War. The history about this transition and their role in creating the United Nations is yet to be written. So anyone who would want to do that should do that. It's very important and it's very under-communicated. Mark Mazzaro has noted this, a few others have noted this, but no one has fundamentally gone in and said, okay, who are these 200 people? Where do they end up? What kind of impact do they have? I know of a few, and I've studied a few, and their impact is quite fundamental because they are the carriers of the institutional experience that needs to be put in to work in the United Nations. And the United Nations, just like the League of Nations, they don't start up in a vacuum. They start up running with massive problems coming in left and right immediately. So what they need is experience, hands-on experience from the very beginning. And so Aghnides is one example. He has a major role in creating the civil servant standard of conduct, and then he also becomes the fiscal. It's a very boring job. I think he actually hates it, but he does a very good job at mediating between the Assembly, the General Assembly, and the Secretary General of the United Nations in negotiating the budget, which is also extremely difficult and where he has kind of 20 years of experience in knowing why that works or doesn't work. But there are other key figures in many parts of the United Nations. Adrianus Pelt in communications, Switzer in communications, Reichmann in UNICEF, etc., etc. It's a very long list, and yeah, it's a very important question, I think. Not to mention that the entire internal administration is basically shoved straight into the United Nations in Geneva, for example. So there's also kind of a history from below waiting to be written on that, I would say. Thanks.
Is there anyone else who would like to raise a question or challenge or push back against Hakon's take on Aghnides? And any closing?
Can I just a very
Brief question, yes.
I don't have a question, I just have a suggestion. You said a few things about the ecumenical and religious underpinnings of his internationalism. I think that some of the personnel in the United States, the League of Nations, they come from imperial contexts and they somehow translate their imperial loyalties into a form of internationalism in the beginning of the 20th century. But that's only a suggestion. Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here and sharing your results, your deliberations, your chapter with us. It's been a very stimulating experience, and also thank you very much to Sotiris Rizas for energizing, let's say, what we came with, so that we have actually a very good discussion on a project which hasn't ended yet, but is on its way to be finished, but also stimulates a lot of other questions, as your question, for example, illustrates. So thank you for coming here also, for attending this lecture today. Thank you very much.